Now, every time I interview Mouin Rabbani, we always get inundated with, I think, pretty justified praise in terms of his analysis, his insight, his wisdom. He's the co-editor of Jadaliya. He's a brilliant Dutch Palestinian analyst based in Canada, though, I believe. So very international in scope. But I really want to talk to you, Mouin, because obviously things have got bleaker since the last time we spoke, which I'm afraid is a constant theme with every conversation I think I've had with you. I just want to start with your thoughts, actually. Great to see you, by the way.
Yeah, very good to be with you, and thanks for having me on again, Owen.
It's always a pleasure, and as I say, you're always very much in demand. I want your take on the destruction of the so-called ceasefire by Israel.
Well, there never was a ceasefire to begin with. If I can just take a moment to explain how we got here. As you know, there was a brief cessation of hostilities in November of 2023, which Israel then refused to extend. And on the 1st of December 2023, its genocidal military campaign resumed in full force. The mediators, Egypt and Qatar, spent the first half of 2024 trying to formulate a proposal that could be accepted by all parties concerned, meaning not only Israel and Hamas, but also the United States. Then finally, in May of last year, Joe Biden, US president at the time, announced a proposal that he said had essentially been formulated by the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. That proposal was then accepted by Hamas in early July of last year. And it seems that it had been designed to be rejected by the Palestinians, because as soon as Hamas publicly announced that it accepted it, Netanyahu began introducing new conditions, that there would be no formal cessation of hostilities, that Israel would not withdraw from the border between the Gaza Strip and Egypt, and various other conditions that Hamas, of course, refused to accept. And then, Biden, with his unconditional, limitless support for Israel, he and his officials said that the only obstacle to a ceasefire was that Hamas was not accepting it, whereas in fact Hamas had accepted the proposal, and it was Israel that was rejecting it. Then in November of last year, you had the US presidential elections. Trump won, Harris lost. And what appears to have been the case is that the incoming president, Trump, did not want to have a foreign policy crisis on his hands on the day of his inauguration, least of all one that involved American hostages in the Middle East. Jimmy Carter had just passed away. There was a lot of recollection of the Iranian hostage crisis of the late 1970s and so on. And so he sent his Middle East envoy, a real estate developer with no prior diplomatic experience, Steve Witkoff, to the Middle East. And it took Witkoff only one meeting with Netanyahu to ensure that Israel accepted essentially the exact same proposal that Biden had issued in May. Of course, he didn't need to put any pressure on Hamas because Hamas had already accepted it. Now, I'm sorry for all the details, but I think it's also important to point out that this wasn't kind of a single comprehensive proposal to end this war and achieve a formal cessation of hostilities and so on, along the lines of what's apparently being discussed with respect to Ukraine or other conflicts. At Israel's insistence, it was a three-stage agreement. The first stage, which was meant to last 60 days, or 42 days rather, and which went into force on the 19th of January of this year, consisted of a suspension of hostilities rather than a formal cessation of hostilities, a limited Israeli withdrawal from the Gaza Strip, a partial Israeli-Palestinian exchange of captives, permission for forcibly displaced Palestinians to return to those areas from which they had been displaced, primarily from the center and south of the Gaza Strip to the northern areas, and a surge in humanitarian deliveries. The second stage was supposed to result in a durable cessation of hostilities, in other words, a formal ceasefire, a completion of the exchange of captives, a completion of the Israeli withdrawal from the Gaza Strip, and a few other things. And although the objectives of the second stage had been specified in the agreement, the mechanism to achieve them had not yet been agreed. So the way this was structured is that on the 16th day of the first stage of the ceasefire, negotiations would begin on agreeing mechanisms to reach the objectives set forth in the second stage, which I just enumerated. I'm putting the third stage to the side for a moment because that concerned mainly post-war reconstruction. Now, from the very outset, basically anyone who had any interest in this issue and had any knowledge of it was explaining that the key obstacle was that the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, for a variety of personal, political, and strategic motives, would not accept to complete or to implement the second stage of the agreement because he did not want a formal cessation of hostilities or a comprehensive Israeli withdrawal from the Gaza Strip. And indeed, Netanyahu virtually immediately indicated that he would not accept entering into negotiations on the second stage, which were supposed to begin on day 16. And there were a variety of other Israeli violations, foot dragging, not fulfilling commitments, and so on. Hamas, for the most part, did fulfill its commitments. There were a few significant incidents. In one case, they returned the wrong body of a hostage who had been killed in captivity, but then they returned the right one. And so the question was always concerned how the Americans would respond. Would they or would they not force the Israelis to enter into serious negotiations on the second stage and to implement the second stage? And this was a broader question. Was Trump merely interested in having a smooth inauguration, or was he genuinely interested in bringing this crisis to a resolution? And what happened is that his Middle East envoy, Witkoff, rather than once again reading the Riot Act to Netanyahu, came with what he called bridging proposals, which basically met Netanyahu's main demand of indefinitely postponing a formal cessation of hostilities while ensuring that Netanyahu's main objectives, the exchange of captives, would continue. So it was basically an extension of the first phase at the expense of the second. Hamas insisted that whatever bridging proposal it would agree to would have to include negotiations on the second phase. And when Witkoff wouldn't basically meet Hamas's demands on that part, rather than making the obvious conclusion that this thing is falling apart because Israel is refusing to meet the commitments it had accepted in January, once again, the Americans put the onus on Hamas as the ones who, rejected the ceasefire proposal and all the rest of it. And indeed, on the 2nd of March, I'm sorry, I need to point out one more thing that was agreed. The other issue that was agreed in this agreement was that at the end of the first phase, so at the end of 42 days, if the parties, so long as the parties continued to negotiate, even if they hadn't reached an agreement, there could be no resumption of hostilities by either party. So what did Israel do? On the 2nd of March, which was the day of the conclusion of the first phase, it reimposed a comprehensive siege of the Gaza Strip, cutting off water, fuel, electricity, food, basically prohibiting third parties from delivering anything to the Gaza Strip. And then when Witkoff's bridging proposal, which basically met all of Israel's demands, but not those of the Palestinians, when that was not accepted, Israel resumed with massive raids on the Gaza Strip. Over 400 people killed in the space of the first 24 hours, nearly half of them children. I believe that was the bloodiest day, actually, since Israel began its genocidal military campaign in October of 2023. So sorry for the convoluted explanation, but I think it's important to understand the pieces of the puzzle in order to see how we got here. There is one other issue here, which is, you may recall, at one point, a second American envoy, Adam Buehler, who has a much more restricted mandate than Witkoff. He's the envoy for U.S. hostages. In other words, the whole ceasefire package and so on really isn't part of his brief. But with the approval of Washington, he traveled to Qatar and, in unprecedented meetings, held direct negotiations with Hamas leaders. And then he came out, and in order to explain himself to both the US and the Israeli media, he said, I talked to these people. It's important to understand what the needs and priorities and limits and red lines of the various parties are. And I found that these are not people with horns growing out of their heads, that they were actually, I think the word he used is nice guys. And then he made the unspeakable error of saying, we're the United States, we're not agents of Israel. And we never heard from him again. My initial assessment was that basically, given his restricted mandate, he went there for a specific reason. He fulfilled his mission, and that's why we no longer heard from him. There appears to have been a concerted campaign from his opponents in Israel, of course, and also within the Trump administration, to sideline him, at least for the time being. And it's quite possible, that Witkoff came to the conclusion he didn't want to experience a similar fate.
I mean, by the way, that you are never convoluted. That was crucial context. On the question of Donald Trump there, and I mean, again, you alluded to it. The people shift between you should take him literally to it's all just a stream of consciousness to this is a negotiating, bargaining position. You're in Canada. Many people would actually say he literally does want to annex Canada. That's not a joke. It's not a negotiating position. He wants to annex Canada. But on the question of Gaza, where he's talking about, in practice, what would be the violent removal of the surviving population, which itself would require genocidal violence. It would be an act of genocide, as genocide scholars themselves say. How literally do you take that, and how much do you think that's feeding into Israel's current strategy, the current phase of its genocidal strategy?
Well, the problem is that you just gave me 3 or 4 different options. And with any other politician, I would have to respond by telling you I think it's A, but not B, or C is more likely than A. In this case, probably all of them are equally accurate, even though they completely contradict each other. The issue here is that you're dealing with an exceptionally erratic, unpredictable, and impulsive leader who will say and do contradictory things within the space, of a single day. And so it's very difficult, I think, to assess anything with confidence. Having said that, he did make this Gaza Riviera proposal. Then he seemed to pull back on it. Then he tried to elaborate it in different ways on different days. He may have intended it seriously. The other thing they say about Trump is that his position at any given moment tends to reflect the immediately preceding discussion he's had. But I think he may have intended it. It may have been a sop to his son-in-law Jared Kushner, who earlier had proposed something similar, along the lines of, well, we'll try yours first and see how it works. And then I think he was genuinely surprised by the Arab response, because, you know, the Arab states, let's not forget, had assumed the position of inert spectators, at best, I should add, for over a year, while Israel was systematically slaughtering Palestinians within their own homeland. The difference here is that he was making a proposal that, from the point of view of Arab governments, presented a direct threat to their individual and collective national security, and was a direct threat to their stability and legitimacy. I can get into the reasons for that later if you want. But on that basis, you know, I think it's fair to say that as an American proposal, I won't call it a plan because there never was one. It was more, you know, a verbal proposal, initiative, if you will. That was stillborn and dead in the water. But that doesn't make it irrelevant, because what it did do is it once again put mass forcible displacement of Palestinians, primarily in the Gaza Strip, but implicitly also from the West Bank. It put it back on the policy agenda. Biden and Blinken had tried something similar in late 2023 and had been rebuffed privately behind closed doors by their key Arab client regimes. But now it's out in the open. And Israel has embraced this proposal as kind of giving it a license to now openly not only discuss, but even to plan for the mass forcible expulsion of Palestinians from the Gaza Strip, or at least from the Gaza Strip. That doesn't mean it's going to happen in the organized manner in which it's being proposed, and that has primarily to do with the very firm rejection of cooperating with such a scheme by the Arab states, primarily Egypt and Jordan. But the idea, you know, that the Israeli government has now established a unit to promote the expulsion of Palestinians and so on, that I think is very alarming, particularly because there has been no firm international response. I mean, people are taking note of it, maybe here and there expressing concern about it, but it has been entirely without consequence. I mean, you had the new foreign policy supremo of the European Union, Katja Kallas, I think her name is, basically traveling to Israel, meeting with Netanyahu, who, let's not forget, is a fugitive from international justice, an indicted war criminal, meeting with him and extolling the closeness of the European-Israeli relationship. Now, to Netanyahu, this sends a clear message. Do whatever you please. There will be no consequences. Your impunity is safe with us.
Speaking of impunity, Israel Katz, the defense minister, issued a blood-curdling statement. I mean, I know that doesn't narrow it down, given the number of genocidal statements of clear genocidal intent which have been issued by the Israeli regime. But this one in particular was just very striking because it was addressed to the citizens of Gaza, and basically said that if, you know, Hamas didn't cooperate, if the demands on Hamas weren't met, then the civilian population would suffer destruction and devastation and death. I mean, it's interesting because he then did another statement a couple of days later, saying we will abide by international law, which is completely contradictory from a genocidal statement of collective punishment. I don't know if that was because the Solicitor General of Israel went, "Could we just calm down for a minute or something? Let's do something that contradicts what you just said." But also is equally then stating to the people of Gaza that we will annex your land in response to Hamas not meeting our demands. I mean, this is, again, that's illegal. It's obviously collective annexing land, full stop, is illegal in those circumstances or any circumstances like that. Because obviously that does speak to impunity. I mean, what do you think? I mean, Israel Katz is regarded even by many Israeli right wingers as a kind of crude, vulgar, stupid man, to be honest, as far as I can tell from reading that wing of Israeli politics. What's your take in terms of? Because in the Financial Times, it's been reported that the intention is the new Israeli chief of the general staff of the IDF is to force the Palestinian population to a very small area, control their calories. Really really reminiscent of certain dark periods in our history, I would say. But what do you think about all of that together? What that says about their strategy and their impunity?
In addition to everything you've said about Israel's defense minister, Israel Katz, he's also the ultimate yes man in Israeli politics. I mean, he's Netanyahu's minion, if ever there was one. So it's not as if, he was taking an independent initiative. We were listening to his master's voice. And this gets back to my earlier point about, the key implication of this Trump proposal is not whether you think the Americans are actually going to implement it or not. Quite clearly, they're not. But the space and legitimacy, for lack of a better word, that it gives for putting mass forcible expulsion back on the policy agenda. And in this case, Katz openly directing blood-curdling genocidal threats at an entire population, the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. Now, his subsequent statement, I completely agree with you. Some lawyer in the defense ministry got a hold of him and said, you better make a clarification or you're going to end up with an arrest warrant like your predecessor, Yoav Gallant, who's, of course, also an international fugitive from justice. But it's quite clear that Israel is now confident that it can behave as it pleases without any restraints whatsoever. And while I would fully agree with those who would say that Trump is placing no restraints on Israel whatsoever, I think it would be both wrong and unfair to pretend that this all started in January of 2025. There were no restraints for a year and a half under the Biden administration. It's inconceivable to me that any president other than Biden, with his passionate attachment to Israel, a self-declared Zionist and all the rest of it, even the most pro-Israeli predecessors that Biden had, Reagan, Bush, Clinton, you name it, I don't think any of them would have been as indulgent of Israel as Biden was, and would have allowed Israel to operate as free of any restraints whatsoever as the Biden administration did. And that, I think, crucially set the stage for what Trump is now allowing Israel to do. In other words, we need to look for continuities as much as we need to look for changes.
In terms of developments at the moment, new developments at the moment, which are, I think, of particular interest, which is the eruption of, I would say, quite significant protests in terms of size in Gaza against Hamas, particularly actually northern Gaza, which has been particularly ruined by Israel's genocidal onslaught. Many, of course, of those survivors returned to their homes and found annihilation. I've been speaking to Palestinians in Gaza who returned to northern Gaza, and it was a hugely traumatic event. Many of them marched back full of defiance and pride when the so-called ceasefire began, and they just were met with horror. I'm just interested. I mean, in terms of what's your take on the nature of these protests, the kind of, how significant they are, how much they speak to broader sentiments in Palestinian society in Gaza?
Well, I think these demonstrations are neither insignificant nor transformative. I think it's difficult to get a precise handle on them, exactly how they erupted, what their objectives are, and so on. So far as I've been able to ascertain, and this is speculative, is that they appear to have started as spontaneous demonstrations in Beit Lahia, in the northernmost area of the Gaza Strip, in response to new so-called evacuation orders that were issued towards these people by the Israeli military. And they began as kind of, let's call them anti-war demonstrations, directed at no one in particular, to call for an end to the war. So if anything, directed at Israel. But then also, you began to see criticism and condemnation and slogans against Hamas in these demonstrations as well. And then you began to see a number of demonstrations in other areas of the Gaza Strip as well. So it's quite difficult, I think, to parse out to what extent these demonstrations are just generalized expressions of opposition to the continuation of Israel's genocidal campaign, and to what extent they are specifically directed at Hamas and the demand that Hamas end its rule over the Gaza Strip. It appears to be a bit of both. But to suggest that this is somehow a popular uprising against Hamas, I think it's very premature, given the size and scope of these demonstrations, to draw that conclusion. I would make several additional observations, which is that when Israel resumed its genocidal military campaign last week, and I should point out, in response to your first question, the ceasefire never really took hold, because even prior to that, well over 100 Palestinians were killed in various Israeli strikes since January 19th. But anyway, when these large-scale massive bombings resumed last week, Israel seemed to be focusing much more on Hamas political leaders and on Gaza government officials, rather than Hamas military leaders and military targets. And it seemed to be that an objective was to paralyze Hamas's ability to maintain administration, maintain law and order, maintain its own rule and hegemony in the Gaza Strip. And therefore, it's quite possible that these demonstrations are in part a response to that, of, on the one hand, the breakdown of Hamas's governing capacity, and on the other hand, of Hamas has been ruling the Gaza Strip hegemonically since 2007. There's been dissatisfaction with Hamas and the Gaza Strip since 2007. So it's hardly a surprise that now, particularly under the current circumstances, you would see these kinds of sentiments expressed. But when you now see the government that's responsible for the genocide seeking to embrace these demonstrators as their own, quite clearly, the main effect is going to be to delegitimize them rather than in any way empower them. And then, of course, there's also a question to what extent Hamas's Palestinian and Arab rivals are encouraging these protests. So you have, for example, Mohammed Dahlan, the former Fatah leader, who's now based in the United Arab Emirates, who's still, throughout this period since 2007, even though he was the main target of Hamas's 2007 seizure of power, has maintained networks within the Gaza Strip and a level of support within the Gaza Strip. Given Abu Dhabi's opposition to the Arab League proposal that came out last month, to what extent is he implicated? To what extent is the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah involved in these demonstrations? I'm not saying that those are the only. Quite clearly, there is at a certain level of popular dissatisfaction with Hamas. There always has been. I assume it's probably more now than it was in October of 2023. But that's hardly surprising. I mean, how many survivors of Uradur were marching in the streets saying "Vive la Résistance"? I suspect not all that many.
Because we mentioned Fatah there, I did want to ask you about the West Bank. You mentioned Fatah over Ramallah. I mean, we've seen their, repeated pogroms, hideous pogroms. I mean, obviously, we've seen recently one of the directors of No Other Land being targeted, but that is the lived reality of people who obviously haven't had the huge platform he's obviously got because of a Oscar-winning, widely lauded film. And we've seen that. I mean, the biggest act of ethnic cleansing there since 1967. I mean, it's just so obviously partly obscured by the horror in Gaza, but obviously also just disinterest by the Western media. I mean, what's your take about what's happening in In the West Bank, I mean, there's also this question of annexation, and the reason, of course, they haven't done annexation actually is just because then, I mean, obviously it's apartheid, but they would just declare to the world this is apartheid. You can't not have, you might as well just call it an apartheid state themselves at that point. I mean, there's other ways of annexing it, I suppose, where they just ring fence the Palestinian cities and then just supplicate them. What do you think? What do you think is going on there?
Well, you can compare it to 1947, in 1947-48, where Israel's priority was getting international acceptance and international legitimacy for the principle of a Jewish state, rather than necessarily how much territory was allotted to that state. So in November 1947, the Zionist movement would have accepted the partition resolution, even if it gave only 2% of Palestine for a Jewish state, because it established the principle of the legitimacy of a Jewish state in Palestine. And of course, they dealt with the territorial dimensions later, and they still are to this very day. I think Israel is now in a very similar situation, where its key priority is getting US recognition of Israeli sovereignty within the West Bank, beyond East Jerusalem. And it's unclear, is the United States going to endorse Israeli sovereignty over the Jewish settlements in the West Bank, over Area C in the West Bank, that 60% of the West Bank that remains under exclusive Israeli jurisdiction and has been largely depopulated of Palestinians? Or will it accept comprehensive Israeli annexation of the West Bank? And I think for Israel, the priority is getting the principle of acceptance of sovereignty over any part of the West Bank at that stage, because once you have that precedent, then you can expand it. The second thing, of course, is that Israel is now involved in a very intensive and extensive initiative in the northern West Bank to try to crush it once and for all. It has forcibly expelled tens of thousands of people from the Jenin, Tulkarem, Tubas areas. It's now active in Nablus. According to some reports, it's engaged in a strategy similar to what it did in the Gaza Strip in the early 1970s, where it basically demolished hundreds of structures in order to broaden the roads in these very densely populated refugee camps, so that Israeli tanks and armored personnel carriers could drive through them at will. According to others, it's engaged in a process of terminal destruction of these refugee camps, because it has always seen them as the main focal points of resistance to its continued occupation. And we'll have to see how that plays out in the coming weeks and months. But again, it's quite right on the one hand to actually look at what Israel is doing and what it is trying to achieve. But in order to understand that properly, we need to look equally carefully at what Israel's Western sponsors and allies are doing in Washington, in London, in Brussels, because ultimately Israel will only go so far as it's allowed to go by Washington, by London, by Brussels. When Brussels, Israel's largest trading partner, says either you stop or else, it will stop. When Washington, which is a main supplier of weapons to Israel, says far and no further, it will immediately halt. I mean, look at how simple it was for Witkoff to force Israel into this ceasefire agreement that Biden claimed, he was having difficulty getting Israel to accept. So yes, let's indeed focus on Israel's policies and actions, but we need to understand them as Israel responding to a very permissive environment and being allowed to act with total impunity and without any restraint whatsoever.
I mean, just finally on that, but to see how bleak that response is. I mean, it's partly just building on what you said. I mean, in the coming period, what do you, I mean, the bleak kind of read would be Israel thinks it has this great window of opportunity now. I mean, what do you think of that versus the Trump unpredictability factor, which could throw up some unexpected results, I guess? But what do you think? I mean, do you think at the moment that the likelihood is Israeli impunity, well, as you said, I mean, it prevailed under Biden. What do you think? How much do you think that the next few weeks and months will be Israel just off the leash, thinking it can basically execute plans it always has dreamt of?
Well, that's the key question. I mean, you have these contradictory forces within the Trump administration. You have one faction for whom, a U.S. war with Iran should have started yesterday, and then you have another faction which is perfectly happy with what Israel does, but wants absolutely no further U.S. involvement in the Middle East, no further U.S. direct military involvement, I should add. So you have an Israeli agenda of seeking to fundamentally transform the strategic environment of the Middle East in its entirety, not just in Gaza, not just in the occupied Palestinian territories, but in Lebanon, in Syria, as we've been seeing, in Yemen, as we're now seeing, and ultimately in Iran. And Greg Kallstrom of The Economist recently had a very interesting thread on Twitter based on a period of time he spent in Washington. And he said, the main issue here is that there's a certain level of, I think chaos was a term he used, but don't quote me on that, in Washington, where you don't really have people in charge enunciating or seeking to implement clear policy. And in this kind of environment where you don't really have anyone in charge calling the shots, that creates opportunities for Israel to do as it pleases and to try to drag the U.S. Along with it, even if it's not necessarily the U.S. agenda. I think the key issue to look at in the coming months is how this U.S.-Iranian relationship works out. Will there be negotiations? Will the U.S. forcefully prevent Israel from either provoking or attacking Iran? And in that context, to what extent will the U.S. recognize, that its bombings of Yemen are of little use, and that if it really wants to restore maritime shipping through the Red Sea and the Suez Canal, well, then you need a ceasefire in the Gaza Strip because nothing else is likely to work. Will it recognize that it urgently needs to reestablish U.S. dominance over Israeli policy and actually implement the January agreement and go to the second stage? At this point, from what we've seen so far, I certainly wouldn't promote optimism.
A bleak but necessarily realistic place to end, I fear. Always an honor, honestly. Always a tour de force. And
thank you very much, Owen.
It's always an honor. For everyone watching and listening, please like and subscribe. Leave your thoughts and your comments. We'd love to hear them. Spread the word, spread the video. But once again, thank you so much for joining us. It was always a pleasure.
Thank you.